Hi, everyone. I am Marcia Marley, President of Success Together. Thank you for joining. There's an echo. I think it's off now. Thank you for joining us for our online version of the fourth annual festival sponsored by Succeed Together. If this is your first event today, I hope you'll join us for a few more this afternoon and tomorrow. The festival is a program of Succeed Together, a nonprofit based in Montclair, New Jersey, that provides free educational services to low-income children in Essex County. If you'd like to support our tutoring and enrichment program, you can donate via the link in the chat on your right-hand side. Succeed Together has never been needed more than during this pandemic. So I hope you'll take some time to give a few dollars to our programs. Today's books are available for purchase through festival partner Watchung Booksellers. You can click on the button at the bottom of your screen to buy them in teal. All our authors appear for free, so please thank them by buying their books. If you have a question for today's speakers, remember to click on the Ask the Question bar at the bottom right of your screen. So put it in the Ask a Question rather than the chat box. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Gabrielle Glazer, for this session on addiction and the family. Gabrielle is the author of the best-selling book, Her Best Kept Secret, Why Women Drink and How They Can Regain Control. And she's also author of the forthcoming book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. She has covered the intersection of health, medicine, and culture for New York Times and many other publications. It is a pleasure to have you, Gabrielle.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. I'm having a really serious echo. There we go. Oh, wait, I do. Oh, gosh. Okay, sorry about that. Better now?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Yeah. Right, I know, now I don't. It's fixed. Okay, sorry about that. That was all my fault. I had two screens open. Sorry about that. I am here today to talk about addiction in the family with Eileen Zimmerman and Larry Westreich, who are respectively, Eileen is the author of Shattered, and Larry is the author of, hold up your book, Larry. You have it? Or one sec. Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. Eileen is the author of Smacked, a story of white collar ambition, addiction, and tragedy. And Larry is the author of A Parent's Guide to Teen Addiction. Today we're going to talk about how addiction affects families. And obviously addiction is something that we are in the middle of, we're in the middle of an epidemic, both in terms of alcohol and in terms of opioids. And Eileen, your book about your ex-husband's, he was addicted to a number of things actually. And you discovered this only long after you had divorced and you were actually after he died. So it must have been an incredibly difficult book to write. And I would love to hear about your process.
Sure. My ex-husband Peter died 5 years after we divorced, and I found him when he died, and at the time thought he died of a heart attack from working too hard. He was a lawyer, he was a partner in a very prestigious Silicon Valley-based law firm, so I couldn't imagine that he had died from complications of injection drug abuse, but he had. And so after the process of settling his estate and uncovering everything that was going on, kind of unraveling the mystery of his life at the time and this entire secret existence, I wrote a piece for the New York Times in 2017 about what happened to him and about substance use and abuse in the legal profession, because it turned out that he was not a one-off, that there was quite a bit of this going on, and I learned that as a reporter. And after that, decided to write a memoir, which included my story, but also Peter's story through my lens. And the process of writing that was difficult, but also cathartic. So it was very hard to write it, but I also needed to write it in a lot of the ways that writers kind of need to put down on paper their experiences to make sense of them. And that's what happened to me. So I did begin writing it, and it was very hard because even though we were divorced and we had all the problems divorced couples with parents had, we also were friends and good friends for half our lives. And I loved him and cared about him and felt, he was my family. So I had to revisit a lot of my history with him, and that involved revisiting kind of a dysfunctional marriage for many, many years, and being a parent in that marriage and feeling disempowered, and then everything that happened with him when we were married and after we divorced, and then his drug addiction and everything that happened because of that. So that process was hard, but very cathartic, and in a way very healing, because from a distance, when you're writing about something like that, you also begin to understand it in a way that you couldn't when you were going through it. And so I feel like in a way it was a real gift, because I was able to put it down on paper and have some perspective and gain some understanding of him and myself, and sort of understand the dynamic and why things were happening the way they were at the time. And I think through that, it really helped me process my own grief. I was busy taking care of my kids and other people and making sure they were okay. And then I was executor of an estate that was very complicated because the person wasn't planning to die. And so everything was a mess and unpaid, and, there were houses to sell, things like that. But I think after all that was done, I had a chance to focus on my own grief and my own feelings of loss. And so this really helped me get through that.
I'm really glad to hear that. I was very, very moved by the book. I have a question for both of you, actually. The language that we use around addiction has really shifted in recent years. In 2013, the DSM-5, which is the Psychiatric Bible, changed the language from, I believe the previous words had been alcohol abuse, substance abuse, but the new lexicon is alcohol use disorder and substance use disorder. And it's my belief that when we use words like junkie or addict, or even the very outdated word alcoholic, we immediately elicit a label, and it's a very negative label. And just the other day in the Times, I was reading about the outdoor restaurants and how, and the writer actually put strung out junkies were
Wow.
somehow being too close to these restaurants and hurting their businesses. And I really took a pause. And I know that both of you also use sensitivity in your language about this problem that people have. To label somebody as an addict or an alcoholic really sort of indicates to me a moral failing, and it's their fault. Nobody chooses to have substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder. And even though the DSM language changed in 2013, we still are hearing addict, junkie, alcoholic. And I would love, Larry, as a physician's point of view, what you think about the shift in language and why we're having such a hard time moving away from those blaming words.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a really nuanced question you ask, and it speaks to exactly what Eileen was talking about. The secrecy that often is associated with addiction problems. The secrecy in your family, unfortunately, is typical. Probably at least one of the reasons you didn't see it because it was being hidden from you in a very sophisticated way. The language question is really important and is something that I struggle with all the time. I wrote a book in 2007 called "Helping the Addict You Love." And even then, I got some pushback from colleagues and from people in recovery who said maybe you shouldn't use that term, but the times are very different then. So I think that now I and my colleagues try to use the actual nomenclature, substance use disorder, that avoids, that uses person first language, right? We don't call someone a diabetic; they're a person with diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's suffering from an addictive disorder is suffering from an addictive disorder as opposed to being an addict or a junkie.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, plenty of people who are in recovery go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and identify themselves as saying, "My name is Joe, I'm an addict and an alcoholic." And I think to some extent, people who are in recovery have sort of taken that term, primarily hateful, and used it in a way that's productive, in the same way that I think the LGBTQ community has said queer. Okay, it was initially meant as an insult, but now it is what it is. So I think the important thing for those of us in the field is to be sensitive to individuals' reactions to that. I certainly don't want to denigrate someone in my who I'm working with. I don't say someone has had a dirty urine. I don't say they're an addict. I use the right terms. They've had a urine toxicology that's positive for the substance we're talking about. So let's talk about that. Mm-hmm. The same way an internist doesn't try to insult me if my blood pressure goes up. I don't insult my patients if they have a slip or a wheal.
Right.
So I think that as an old English major, I think language is enormously important, and I could talk for the rest of the hour about it.
Well, we could actually. I just want to pick up very quickly on the word that you used when you say slip, instead of the older term, which is relapse, which is sort of a shaming word. And oh my gosh, I'm back at square one, and I'm really ruined. It's sort of like when I was doing research on alcohol use disorder. It's sort of like when people would tell me about their harm reduction methods in using or drinking less heavily, they would liken it to a person who loses 50 pounds. Let's say you're 50 pounds overweight and you lose 25 pounds. You're on your way to your goal, and at Christmas time over the holidays you gain 5 pounds. You gain 5 pounds from eating too much of grandma's fudge. That doesn't mean the whole 20-pound loss is wiped out. It's a slip. It's not a relapse. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about in your practice what that word means.
A slip or a relapse. You mentioned harm reduction, and I think there's this false dichotomy between people who believe in harm reduction and those who believe in abstinence only. Mm-hmm. Everyone in my field practices harm reduction. If they're not treating addicted people, because people with addiction have slips and relapses all the time. So I think it's important to view it exactly the way that you said. If someone makes an improvement in their blood pressure, that's great. We'll try to push that forward. If someone has less use this month than they did last month, we need to motivate them to continue decreasing their use of the substance. In the same way, we probably think that teenagers in the high school shouldn't be having sex, but if they're going to, they need to use condoms. Harm reduction. It's the same idea with drugs and alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Eileen, do you think that that Peter would ever have, if he'd been confronted about his drug use? I'm sure you must have had those conversations in your head a million times. What do you think would have happened? Do you think he would have been willing to just stop and become abstinent, or would he have wanted to cut down, or how we, obviously he's not here, we can't answer that question, but
right.
What are those conversations like for you in your head?
I think the conversations in my head, it's right before he died, about a month before he died, he and I got very close to him admitting what was going on. I have a scene in the book, and it actually happened where I could hear in the background that he wasn't at home. There was music in the background. It was very odd. He would normally be at home or working. And I just said, "Where are you?" And he said, "No place," or something. And I just said, I said, what is wrong with you? I said, you have so much money. Why don't you just check yourself into some place and figure out what's wrong with you? And I mean, I was so close to that point. And he said, I can't, it's too late. And I said, and I remember he said, what do you want me to do? Tell the kids that I'm really sick? Because he had been so sick in front of them. And I said, are you very sick? And he just said, I'm doing the best I can. And I thought at that moment, like, if I just pushed more, if I had known in the spectrum of things I was considering that it was an addiction issue, that he was struggling with this, addiction to these substances, I could have said, I think I know what it is. Can I say what it is? And if I'm right, let me help you. I think he might have let me help him, but I knew him, and he probably would have shut me down and said, like, there's nothing you can do. I'm going to take care of this myself. Because his particular psychology was, he was a lawyer. He was very good at what he did. He always provided the answers to things. And he was, I'm sure, desperately afraid of losing his life the way he knew it. I'm sure he thought if they found out what was going on at the firm, he'd lose his license. He was a partner leading cases, and he was impaired. He wasn't showing up at work. He wasn't making sense. So I think he was desperate to try to just kick it himself and then get back to work. Not, I think, fully understanding how much these substances, had hijacked his brain and body. This is somebody who always powered through everything. He did not take sick leave, So he probably, and I saw in his notes, he had been planning to quit, and I think he just thought, I'll quit. I'll just take a week off. I'll quit, as if it was easy, or not easy, but he could do it. So I think all that to say, I don't think he would have let me help him. I think he would have thought, I don't want anyone to know about this. This is my private problem, and I'm going to handle it. Which of course is a huge problem, because if he had just reached out, I think if he'd reached out to a colleague at his firm, I think they would have helped him for sure. But I think he felt like he couldn't.
I have two questions about that. And the first one is about, you have it in your subtitle, and Larry, you deal with this in your practice, I'm sure. And it's about the socioeconomic expectation that we have around addiction in this country. And again, this harks back to a little bit to the word junkie or addict. And we tend to think people are skid row bums, or another horrible thing to say. But one of the shocking things in your life, probably the biggest shock you ever had, was realizing that your white collar ex-husband was using a variety of substances. And you said, I remember very clearly what you said to, I think it was the EMT who you spoke to first.
He was the medical examiner, yeah.
Yeah, but he's rich. He lives in this house. It couldn't possibly be an addiction. Right. So I'd love to hear you speak about that, and then Larry, you also address that in terms of the parents and the adolescents, the young people that you see, and how you have to brush those thoughts that we have about who is affected by addiction aside. So what was that like for you, Eileen?
So I think also this was 2015, and I certainly wasn't sophisticated in this area. So I was saying addict, and so was everyone around me. The medical examiner, we think he was an addict, And I mean, he was so much more than an addict. He was somebody who was struggling with an addiction. And so I think what I learned about myself from that was that I had a lot of implicit biases about what a drug addict, quote unquote, or someone with an addiction, whether it's alcohol or drugs or shopping or anything else. But my idea of somebody who was addicted to drugs was someone that was either poor, who was not well educated. It maybe was white, but more often than not, probably was somebody of color. And I am someone who considers myself liberal and progressive and not racist and not classist. And what I learned was I was racist and classist and all those things. And also those biases in my mind about what somebody with a drug addiction looked like blinded me to what was right in front of me. The reality in front of me was that I was staring in the face somebody who had all the symptoms of addiction, but I decided it couldn't, I didn't even enter my mind that it was that. And so I think that's what the biggest aha moment for me was at the house. That moment, I thought, well, this can't be, look at this. He had all the resources anybody could want. Well, how could he wind up going down this road? Plus, in his unique situation, he had also been a scientist before becoming an attorney. So he was a chemist and understood exactly what putting those chemicals in his body was going to do to his brain and then his body. I also think there was a certain level of arrogance, because when you are an attorney at that level in a very hot Silicon Valley firm, you think like, that's not going to be me. I'm going to be able to use this and have some fun, without understanding how quickly he was going to be hijacked into this. So I think there was all of that going on. But I did learn that about myself, and I'm working very hard to correct that. I went back to school and got a master's in social work and worked with people that were struggling with addiction. And so I'm really trying to change myself and also work on my biases.
Thank you for that. Larry, how does this, the issue of class and socioeconomic achievement, attainment figure into your practice?
Really important. And I had similar experience. I did my training at Bellevue Hospital for 2-year fellowship. Then I worked there for 6 years. And I'd work there from 9 to 5. Then I'd walk to my private practice on Park Avenue. And the patients in the Bellevue Emergency Department, where I could clearly identify them as homeless. I could clearly identify the substance use disorder that they had, and it was almost easy. Then I'd walk to my office, and someone in a business suit would come in after work because her husband said she had an alcohol problem, but her husband was just mistaken. And I was fooled so many times by the wrapping, by the appearance of the person in front of me, that I really, over the years, have had to, continually remind myself it's the same process, regardless of socioeconomic level or anything like that. The second thing I would say in reaction to what Eileen had to say is that I typically get a call from someone who says, so-and-so, he's very high functioning. And what that usually means, as you said, that the person is doing fine in their job, or at least they still have their high functioning job, but they're failing in their relationships, in their marriage, in their relationship with their kids, and they're failing in their physical health, and they're failing in all kinds of ways. But that one very important thing is preserved, and that's what fools people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often profession. I treat impaired physicians, and oftentimes someone will come in, on death's door from some addictive disorder, yet they're still functioning okay in the hospital. No one's making any complaints about them.
And Eileen, for you, for Peter, the people who were surrounding Peter at that point, other than your kids, you didn't have other friends in common. You weren't in contact with his colleagues. It wasn't as if, one of his work buddies could have called you up and said, hey, something's really going on with Peter. So it sounds like he was able to conceal that, and also that he became more and more isolated in his addiction. Yeah. One thing that I wanted to ask you both about is, obviously the world is paying a lot more attention to addiction today because of the opioid epidemic. And opioid deaths are very dramatic. You come home, you see somebody with a needle in their arm or overdose from fentanyl, and it's painful, traumatic. It's sort of what you witnessed, Eileen. Yeah. And at the same time, we have an alcohol epidemic that is responsible for about 88,000 deaths per year, which is far more than opioid deaths. And we really aren't looking at that very carefully. And I'm wondering if either, Eileen, now did you finish? Did you complete?
Okay. I did, finally.
Congratulations. Okay, so you're both in this realm of helping professions with people and their souls. And do you, what thoughts do you have about the fact that excessive drinking, and certainly anecdotally during the pandemic, it looks like it's people are drinking like fish, and I can understand that. There's no demarcation between the workday and the end of your day, and a glass of wine or a bottle of wine in some cases really helps make that buffer. But we're not really talking about it. And I'm wondering, A, why you think we're paying more attention to the opioid epidemic, and B, I mean, it's sort of obvious, but B, and also B, why is it that we don't talk about excessive drinking?
Do you want me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I can tell you that that's an interesting question, because I just researched an article I think is going to run in The Guardian in a couple of weeks about what's happening during the pandemic for professionals and use. And they are drinking a lot because the day doesn't seem to be like it is a demarcation. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of increased day drinking. But I did talk to a bunch of addiction psychiatrists and professionals at Hazel and Betty Ford and other places. And I think the problem, you're right, Gabrielle. That's a very good question. And I asked that in my research about white collar drug use too. And it's because alcohol is such a deadly drug, but it's legal and it's socially acceptable. And I saw the same thing in my research with cannabis. So there's also a lot of cannabis use before and now during the pandemic, and ever since medical marijuana has made it so much more of a powerful psychoactive substance than it was when we were kids, smoking pot. So it's a really powerful drug. It's legal in a lot of states. It's medically legal in a lot of states. And then alcohol, which has been legal for forever and is also very lethal. And I think there's something so much more socially acceptable about those two substances. So when you hear people joking about day drinking, it's not really a joke. It's really serious, but it's so socially easy to talk. I found everybody talking about that is not the problem. But when you hear about an opioid death or a death from an overdose of cocaine or methamphetamine, it is so much more dramatic and scary, and there are needles involved, and there's pipes for smoking and all this stuff. And with alcohol, it's a wine glass. It's beautiful. And I think with cannabis, it's so easy and it's accessible. They'll deliver it to your door. So my feeling is that those are really, really terribly difficult problems, and they're very dangerous. But you're right. We just there's so much more socially acceptable that we just focus on opioid overdoses and rising cocaine use and meth use and all of that. But really, the other two substances are, I think what's going to do us in, to be honest. I think they're really serious.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think the salience of the opioid overdoses is much higher because it's there's the needles, there's the illegality of it. It's much easier to make the case for someone that their loved one has a problem if it's illegal what they're doing. I mean, there's a spectrum of people who drink every day, don't really have much problem, all the way to people who kill themselves drinking that way. And it's going to be the same thing with cannabis. It's just a percentage problem, right? A certain number of people who try alcohol will become dependent on it. A certain percentage of people who try cannabis will become dependent on it. It's just arithmetic. So when it's more available, it becomes more dangerous to a larger population. I would up the ante. I mean, tobacco kills 400,000 Americans every year. And when was the last time we addressed that in a serious way? I think the difference is the salience issue also. People die with their first use of cocaine or opioids. Tobacco usually takes 30 or 40 years to kill you. It's harder to make the case that someone needs to get help with it, notwithstanding the fact that it's the most dangerous drug we have.
And also, I wonder, just to follow up, I interviewed a guy when I was doing my book who was a guy in finance, and he had a very young guy in his 30s. He had such bad problems with alcohol that he had developed pancreatitis, a problem with, he almost died in a hospital. And he was about 7 months into his recovery and his sobriety. His wife was pregnant. And I remember him saying to me, I think I'll be able to drink again. I want to be able to socialize with my friends and stuff. And I was thinking, this man's going to die. I just thought he was so sick. He went up with sepsis. And if that doesn't, and yet still the pull of this drug, and not just the drug, the fact that it's associated with this entire social milieu he's in, I just thought, how do you help this person? It was so sad to me.
That you actually just made a perfect segue into what I was formulating for my next question. The whole thing about using alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder is that it implies a spectrum. You can be a mildly someone who's on the mild end of the spectrum and really not have a problem, or you can be someone in the middle, or you can be somebody who has a very severe problem, which obviously the guy with pancreatitis certainly had. Right. And it used to be that the only yardstick for getting better, if you had an addictive disorder, was abstinence, and that was it was a very binary way of looking things. You were either an alcoholic or an addict, or you weren't. Period. Full stop. And the only way to get better was by going cold turkey and never using again. We now have a much more sophisticated view of and yardsticks for how to get better that involve moderating, and there are a lot of different ways to go about that. Certainly in alcohol use disorder, there are anti-craving medications, there are moderation apps, there are all sorts of things. But what do you think? Is there a safe way to use, I know this is probably a really horrifying question, but is there a safe way to use some of the more illegal drugs? Larry?
Yeah, my response to that is actually, I don't doubt that people use cocaine and opioids in small amounts on occasion at parties, and sometimes people use them even regularly. To get high with. Like, there's a name for them called chippers. But I never meet those people because they never come to my office.
Right.
People who come to my office are people whose lives are being destroyed. So if they say, well, I think I can use, opioids maybe once a week on Saturday night, I would say, you had 3 ER visits for overdoses. You have needle tracks on your arm. You're about to lose your family. I don't think so. But so are there people who use these drugs occasionally? Yes, but they usually don't come to clinical attention. If they do, by definition, they're going to have a hard time doing it as a chipper.
Yeah. And I would say, Gabrielle, to add to that, also in my research, I talked to a lot of professionals that were very accomplished that did use opioids, fentanyl. I interviewed a doctor that used fentanyl. He just, very small amounts of it, not opioids. And I had asked him, do you feel that it compromises you ethically? And he said, I'm a doctor. I know how to dose, And I talked to a lot of tech executives or tech professionals. I wouldn't say executives, but people that were definitely professionals that used Adderall and Ritalin and other stimulants, cocaine. They would use a lot of party drugs like ketamine and microdosing LSD, and felt like it helped with their creativity and focus, kept them productive. They were able to, build an app and also run their company. And they didn't seem to feel like it was an issue. They felt like it was a hacking. They were kind of hacking themselves and their minds using these substances so that they could, be better, like the bionic man, like they could do more, be better. And they didn't feel that the downside was big enough to stop. They didn't feel like it was really adversely affecting their health.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We talked about something the other day when we first met online, and it's about the role of interventions and the very dramatic scene that we see frequently on television, where somebody who is a paid interventionist comes in at the behest of a family and says, okay, enough of your behavior. The family says, we love you. Everybody sits around and says, you've hurt me with your addictive behavior in this way, in this way, in this way, in this way. And the interventionist takes the person off to rehab. Is that a fair description of that process? Yeah.
I've got strong opinions about it. You want to speak?
Right, I know. And that's what I was getting at. So I wanted to ask you about I know from my research it's highly, highly, highly ineffective, and it typically tends to backfire. But I wanted to ask you, Larry, what your opinion is, and if you could tell people in the audience why it may not be as effective as people believe.
You just described the typical Vernon Johnson intervention that's done the way we saw it in the TV show intervention. As you said, you described it perfectly. You give an ultimatum to the person: either you go to treatment right now, or you can't stay in the house. You lose your job. We're going to stop supporting you, X, Y, and Z. And the issue is that sometimes that is necessary, but that's the last thing you do, not the first thing you do. Mm-hmm. My whole work, and anyone who works in the field, is interventions, but they're not those huge caliber interventions. Sometimes someone will say, I want to arrange an intervention, get an interventionist. And I say, well, have you told your husband that you're concerned? No.
Right.
And so I like a lot better the small caliber interventions, where you're able to try to move someone towards treatment without the risk of pushing them away or getting them to say, take a hike, I'm not listening to any of this. And so in my experience, and the data are pretty clear on this too, when you're intervening with someone, it's low expressed emotion interventions that help over time. And they're, unless there's a dire situation and you've tried everything else, to my mind, you don't do a classic intervention.
Mm-hmm. And can you describe what some of those small interventions are?
Yeah, from someone who's in the family to say, look, your drinking really concerns me. Can we talk about it? And sometimes that causes the dam to break, right? The person had no idea that anyone knew that he was drinking every day when he comes home for lunch. With friends, I often, say the same thing. Take the person aside in a quiet place, talk about the concern that you have. And even if the first response is to push you away, he may come back to you in a couple of weeks. So I'm very much in favor of interventions. I'm just not in favor of firing the nuclear warhead the first chance you have. Because sometimes people just, it fails. There are suicides after them. There are certainly a lot of people who don't do what's asked of them, and then you don't really have any place else to go.
Eileen, are you in clinical practice yet?
I just finished my graduate work a few weeks ago, so I'm studying to take the licensing test. So I had field work where I did work in a clinical practice where I was supervised by a licensed clinical social worker. So I have worked with, I worked in the Bronx at a clinic for people that were very poor that had chronic health conditions, including addiction and substance use disorder. And then I worked at a cancer organization last year.
Mm-hmm. I just was wondering if you were planning on sort of focusing on addiction in families or helping people with use disorders.
That's so funny because my first field work, I thought like anything but addiction because I'd just been marinating in it. And but I wound up, that's where I was placed, and it was actually really great. And I really enjoyed working. I mean, it seemed very difficult because also the population had so few resources, and everything was a struggle. Housing was a struggle. Food was a struggle. So it was really easy to use and just kind of escape their reality, which was bleak. But it was also really like wonderful because I understood also how complicated it is when someone makes a decision or not to start using a substance that's going to wind up taking them down a road they probably never, and put them in a situation they didn't intend to be in. And so it gave me a lot of insight into that. And I think I would be very open to working with addiction and families. I'm sort of trying to figure out where the need is and see how I can be of use, not to be corny, but that's sort of what I'm looking at it, how I'm looking at it.
I wanted to ask, we're going to take some questions from our viewers in a second, but I wanted to ask one final question. Early on in the book, in fact, I think it's in the introduction, you describe Peter's adoption.
Yes.
And you mentioned very briefly that people who are adopted suffer at higher rates of addiction than other people. And it's certainly something I have been researching a boch about.
Yes, I was looking forward to that. Yes.
And I did come up with that quite frequently. There's a much higher rate of suicide. And I just wondered if, number one, did Peter ever find his birth family?
He had it was a very odd situation in his family. He never had, I would say, do you have any curiosity? Do you want to find one of your birth parents or both of them? And he just said, I got one nutty family is enough. I don't need to get involved with another, but he would always pass it off. And everybody wondered why he wasn't curious. And in his family, his mother they would sometimes say, like, when we got Peter, not when Peter was a baby. And I remember thinking, it wasn't that they didn't love him. They did. They were devastated by his death. But that was a very odd way to put it, when we got him. So like, almost like he's the one who was like purchased. I mean, that wasn't it, but like gotten, while the other two he had a biological brother and sister. And then when he was older, his mom had told me that he'd been in a foster home with someone before he was adopted who had a lot of young children. So he was cared for well, but he wasn't held a lot. And she said when they first adopted him as a 4-month-old, he wasn't really affectionate for a long time. It took him to become more affectionate and, I guess, bonded to them. And then when I did my research, Gabrielle, which I'm sure is just the tip of what you have discovered in researching your forthcoming book, that's a really important part of a human being's development, is that very early attachment. And here was a baby that wasn't being held that much, and was given up by its adoptive mother, by its biological mother, his biological mother. And I just think that there's a lot of complicated stuff that comes from this, and from studying human development now, I understand how important and crucial that period in his life was. And it does make me understand a lot of things about him. He was sort of a bottomless pit. Like, if he did something nice for you and you said thank you, it was almost like you could never thank him enough. You could never love him enough. There was never enough of whatever it was he needed, because I think he couldn't fill whatever it was he was looking for. And I often wonder how much of that, or if that, is related to his being adopted. Because I also know other adults who were adopted as babies who have like incredibly warm, rich, wonderful family relationships. So I'm sure it's far more complicated than I imagined, but I do wonder how much it had to do with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of really primal rejection going on there. Even if it wasn't intended to be, even if he wasn't intended to be rejected, a lot of women were forced to relinquish their children. But I am, and Larry, just very quickly, do you see increased use disorders among adolescents who've been adopted?
I've seen the data sets that say exactly that. I mean, it's not clear whether it's because of the nurture you're talking about, or maybe they came from a set of parents who had, drug and alcohol problems themselves, and there's a genetic component. So there's an association, but what causes the association, I don't know.
Right, and the medicating the PTSD that comes from the All right, I'm going to take a look at these questions. So here's the question: do addiction professionals still consider some people as having more addictive personalities, and that's in quotes, than others, or is that a dated notion?
Could you say that? Do professionals?
Do addiction professionals still consider there to be such a thing as an addictive personality in quotes? Is there such a thing?
Larry,
I can speak for myself. I won't speak for all addiction professionals, but I do think that it's certainly true that people who misuse substances have more compulsive behaviors in their life. But I'm not sure there's some, unified field theory of an addictive personality, because I think the reasons that people are driven to use addictive substances are so varied that it's almost individual to the person, him or herself. So I'm not comfortable with the addictive personality idea, but I agree that people who use substances are often compulsive in many ways.
Here's another question that we really haven't touched on: the depression and anxiety that really often fuel addictions. And that's really important. There are a host of risk factors: anxiety, depression, having had adverse childhood events, having been sexually abused, having been in a war. All of these things really are risk factors. Also, an eating disorder is another far more women who suffered from eating disorders as young women tend to often grow up to or grow into an alcohol addiction. So I don't know if either one of you wants to talk about that.
I'm just trying to get my head around the question. So the question.
Well, we didn't. I think it's important to know.
Oh, depression
and we didn't. So that was.
So I can certainly speak to professionals that I studied for the book and that I've been researching now. Like, I would say that so many of the, especially the men I interviewed, because I didn't interview as many women. There didn't, at least in my anecdotal research, there weren't as many women, at least professionals, that were forthcoming about their substance use disorders. The men were, but they all cited anxiety. I will say that was the number one thing. They were anxious, and so they were drinking to calm down, or they were using benzodiazepines and opioids just to take the edge off. And they felt, or they were drinking a lot and had either cocaine or opioids somehow would make it easier to get through the day. But it was all related to anxiety. And then right behind that, for me, from what I found, was depression. Just feeling really, a lot of it was related to the work, being very unhappy or disappointed in the profession they chose, having really abusive managers and bosses, being in impossible situations with deadlines and stress. And then on the other hand, family and children and demands from that end, and being unable to cope with it in a healthier way, decided to sort of self-medicate, quote unquote. Most of these people did not choose to go to psychotherapy or see a professional to get some help, and maybe even a medication to address their mental health issues that was not addictive. It was like, I'll just have a drink when I get home. Maybe I'll have a bottle of wine it would roll into. And then before you know it, you're having a plastic bottle of vodka in the shower in the morning so your wife doesn't hear it hit the floor, or you're, snorting heroin, right? Whatever it was, just to get some relief from the constant stress and pressure and anxiety and depression.
Here is the question. Somebody asked about the potential legalization of marijuana in New Jersey and New York. I come from a state, Oregon, where it's been legal for quite some time. And right now nobody can walk down the street in Portland without smelling smoke, period, which is a horrible tragedy. But in ordinary times, you cannot walk down the street without getting a contact high. And I don't know, I actually haven't been following what's happening with car accidents in the state. I really don't know what the long-term impact on public health is. Larry and Eileen, do you have thoughts about that?
I do. I mean, I think there are two questions. One is a public policy question, right, of civil liberties versus stopping people from harming themselves. And I think people make a fair argument that if people of color are imprisoned more often for small amounts of drug, that's a bad thing. If we're spending tax dollars to spend our cops chasing around high school kids with joints, that's probably a bad use of public funds, and all the arguments that the decriminalization people make. And I think, but I've set that public policy argument aside. In my practice, I'm hopelessly biased against marijuana because I see people whose lives are destroyed by it. So as a clinician, I don't think more people should be using marijuana, although it's going to make my practice even more full. It's not what I want. And so, as a clinician, it's going to be hard for me to go along with decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana. And I do appreciate there's a different public policy argument, but it's a different argument.
Right. The follow-up question to that that one person asked was, how do you approach this topic with young teenagers without sounding like you're 97 years old?
Right.
Oh, yeah. Larry, do you want to speak to that since you...
Well, yeah, I've got views on it. Do you want to speak? I mean,
I'll just tell you that my views changed. I lived for many years in California for about 25 years, and so I was really pro legalization and all of it. And after I did the research for this book, I talked to so many addiction psychiatrists and therapists that said because cannabis is so strong now that it's become this powerful substance, and I'm sure, Larry, you know this, there's been a rising incidence of psychotic illness, because if you are predisposed to some sort of psychotic illness like schizophrenia, this cannabis will fast track you to it. And I also had a lot of professional psychiatrists and psychologists tell me their fear is that because it's so powerful and because it's so insidious, you're not going to have, 70,000 people die of an overdose of cannabis, but you are going to have people that are not motivated, that are not driven. For instance, look at our situation now. What if everybody just got high and didn't vote, or they don't achieve as much professionally? And then there's research. It's very uncertain now what happens to the developing adolescent brain. I cited a study in my work, and this is a couple of years ago, where the study found, what I'm remembering is that even one joint when you're 14 has a profound effect on brain development. So we don't really know what's going to happen because this is a whole new kind of marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right. Even no one who's responsible on the decriminalization side says that people under the age of 24 should use any kind of marijuana. But I think your question is apt about how you avoid seeming like an old fuddy-duddy when someone gets pulled into their office because they're using marijuana. Every once in a while, I see a high school kid whose mom found them in the basement smoking a joint, and they do it once a month, and they're fine. But the majority of adolescents I see in my office for marijuana tell me they don't smoke much marijuana, but I can smell it from 6 feet away. They use a lot of marijuana. They have not gone to school for 2 or 3 months. They quit their sports teams. None of their friends come by anymore because they're boring. So rather than giving a moralistic argument about what they're doing, I say let's look at what's happening in your life right now. And mostly they agree that none of those things are good things. So that's where we have to start from. It's a tougher and tougher argument to make as it becomes more and more decriminalized. But that's the world we live in.
I mean, there's a question. Do you see it?
Let me get my glasses on.
No, it's okay. It says, after your husband died, how old were your kids? Did you tell them immediately after why their father died? After he died, did you keep his addiction a secret from his friends, from his colleagues at work? Did there come a time when you told them the truth, or did your book do that instead?
All of that is in the book, but I will say my kids were 16 and 18 when their dad died, and at first, the day that he died, I asked the medical examiner and a couple of retired nurses that were there as grief counselors what I should do, because I really didn't know what was best. But we did tell them that day, and it was definitely the right thing to do, because my kids were blaming themselves for their father's death, thinking, that if they'd gotten him to the hospital the night before, he would have lived, when none of that was true. And telling them that was a great relief. I think, Gabrielle, I'm sure you agree with me. The truth is very liberating. And I think for them, gave them a greater understanding of how complicated the problem was and how little power they had to change it. And I will say, though, that I did feel like I was living a little bit in a John Grisham novel for a while. I was very afraid to say how Peter actually died. Number one, it felt kind of just shameful that this my daughter had said this to me just a few months ago, that she was very ashamed for a while that this happened in our family. All those biases again, like this doesn't happen to us. And then I really needed the firm's help. I was a writer. Peter was a lawyer. I relied on his income to help me raise our kids in San Diego. And so I needed the firm to help me sort things out and get through his benefits and insurance and things like that. And I also got this feeling from them that I should not be telling people how he died. I was never told that explicitly, but there are a lot of things that happened I couldn't put in the book for legal reasons that gave me the impression that it was best for me to keep my mouth shut. And so I did. And I hid it for about 1.5 years from everyone except close family and friends. And it was making me sick. I was developing a lot of anxiety. I had acute stress disorder from it. And I needed to talk about it. And so I decided I would, but it was about 18 months. I sort of would tell people, I had this line I used that was, Peter was living a very unhealthy life. So I wasn't lying, but I wasn't really telling the truth. And that's how I did it.
Well, I think, it's getting to be the moment where we need to wrap up, but I think that's a really powerful point to sort of reflect upon, is that the importance of, first of all, addiction is, and substance use disorders, alcohol use disorder, are rife in our society. Obviously, there millions of people are touched by them. I think something like 18 million people misuse alcohol, and I don't know. I can't think that off the top of my head what the number is for opioids, but the importance of being transparent about it is really a brave thing to do, Eileen. And I was really honored to read your book, and Larry, also to see how you help parents approach the topic with their kids.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle, Eileen, and Larry, for such an extremely informative and moving discussion that I think everyone in the US and probably the world should hear. Not just people that have this problem in their family, but all of us. I want to remind our participants that are listening to this that if you haven't bought the author's books, please do so via the green button below, the teal green. You might want to give them as gifts to friends, etc., or read them yourself. And consider donating to Succeed Together, so we can continue offering our free online tutoring and enrichment classes for low-income families in Essex County. We want to give a special thank you to our festival sponsors, event partners, festival friends, volunteers, and staff, as well as everyone who has helped us put on our festival event. Thank you. We have more events coming up today and tomorrow. The next at 2 p.m. is a conversation on gender politics, breaking boundaries, that I'm sure you do not want to miss. Take a look on our Crowdcast channel to sign up. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.